Well, good afternoon once again from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street, Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Today, the topic I'm going to do my best to talk about is a book that has frequently been described both by literary critics and noted publications like the Atlantic Monthly as the greatest of American novels. Sixth of Herman Melville's 11 books, Moby Dick or the Whale was described by its author as a romance in a letter to his publisher, a clear reference to a statement made by the writer's friend, to whom Moby Dick was inscribed in admiration of his genius, fellow author Nathaniel Hawthorne, in an introduction to his book, The House of Seven Gables, where he asserts, "When a writer calls a book a romance, it need hardly be observed that he wishes to claim a certain latitude, both as to its fashion and material, which he would not have felt himself entitled to assume had he professed to be writing a novel." So, published in 1851, same year as Hawthorne's book, novel or romance, in a rather unconventional use of that term, Moby Dick, at 135 chapters with a single-page epilogue, presents a significant set of ambiguities with respect to its nature as a literary work, and that, to quote the rock band Chicago, is only the beginning, only just the start. What kind of tale is Moby Dick, anyway? Possible answers include a high seas adventure story, the depiction of an individual's journey from misanthropy to some kind of personal salvation, a detailed depiction of the 19th century whaling industry, a study of madness and megalomania, or an extensive allegory regarding the relationship of human beings to the universe, or the God believed to have created it, and of course, all of the above. The most correct answer, naturally enough for me at any rate, just happens to be the last of these alternatives, all of the above. Melville himself, according to Denham Sutcliffe, in an afterword for the 1961 Signet Classic publication of the work, said that he did not want his book to be read as a hideous and intolerable allegory, and yet a symbolic element in terms of a conflict between man and God is a fundamental part of the story being told. Consequently, when taking all of the aspects of the narrative together, what it seems needs to be decided is which of them just happens to be the most significant. For me, to even begin thinking about that question, it's necessary to balance the various aspects of the work against one another, admitting the equality of their presentation, but still considering the varying degree of their relative equivalence. When weighing these factors, I tend to think that the treatment given to this work of literary expression by science fiction writer Ray Bradbury and motion picture director John Huston for the 1956 movie starring Richard Basehart and Gregory Peck, in spite of its special effects limitations, pretty much got things right. Moby Dick is an adventure story, and it is a chronicle of the whaling industry during the 1800s. And it's a pair of psychological studies into depression and obsession, but it also presents a fundamental confrontation between human will and either the cosmic or divine forces of nature. Within that context, in terms of the American experience, I think it's necessary to go well back beyond the writing of the book and even before the birth of Melville himself in the city of New York on the 1st of August in 1819. Context that I feel needs to be taken into consideration reaches back in the New World to at least the 1620 arrival on Plymouth Rock in the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the first 46 pilgrims fleeing King Charles I's England in search of the religious freedom to persecute anyone whose beliefs were different from their own. Some 121 years later, that evangelical zeal was crystallized as part of a great awakening in Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and then modulated under the influence of 19th century European Romanticism by Ralph Waldo Emerson to become a non-sectarian, transcendental notion of the omnipresence of God within a natural world that he was believed to have created. It's this sequence of ideas that I think deeply influenced Melville, in which, in my opinion, he represented through the allegorical aspects of Moby Dick. First, within the context of mid-19th century America, awareness of Judeo-Christian beliefs and the book called the Bible can fairly reasonably be assumed. Also, the extensive lecturing career of Ralph Waldo Emerson, carrying him during the 1830s and 40s from his home in Concord, Massachusetts, to the western banks of the Mississippi River, along with his published essays melding Christianity together with Romanticism, would have served to make transcendentalism, the idea that God is constantly present within nature, can use its forces to enact his will, and can be understood through its study, well within the realm of common public awareness. Add to this Melville's friendship with his dedicatee, Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose tuition to Harvard Emerson had paid in addition to the rent on his Concord home, and I think there would somewhat naturally be a high degree of familiarity for Hawthorne's friend Herman Melville with transcendental concepts. Now, combine this with a broad general biblical awareness, and it seems pretty likely that a subtext for the surface narrative of whaling adventure on the seas of the world could well be both a probable and highly significant aspect hiding in plain sight between the lines of Melville's book, even if he personally sought to downplay it. Still, as Denham Sutcliffe pointed out, there's the risk of going too far and posing such questions as, what does this bench stand for? Could it be Calvinism? So on and so forth. Like an ink blot Rorschach test, readers can bring their own preoccupations and even conspiracy theory style thinking to an interpretation of this book, like, for instance, Edward F. Ettinger in his Melville's Moby Dick, a Jungian commentary. A reasonable approach, however, I believe, lies within the realm that combines a surface narrative with the plausible implications which can be derived from what seem to be an intentional set of allusions. So, the first problem presented by what is very likely one of the most famous opening sentences in world literature. Call me Ishmael. One simple imperative sentence, and really three problems. Who's being addressed? You, the reader, presumably. Who's meant by the word me? Is it the fictional narrator? Or, given that a pronoun replaces refers to a previous noun, the author of the work, Herman Melville? And finally, who was Ishmael, and what reasonable associations can be derived from that name? Just addressing the last of these three concerns. Ishmael, according to the Bible's Old Testament 16th chapter, the book of Genesis, was the illegitimate son of the patriarch Abraham with his wife and half-sister Sarah's Egyptian slave and handmaiden, given to him by his assumed to be barren 90-something-year-old sibling spouse, so that he could, nearing his own century mark, have a child, who then became outcast into the wilderness with his mother when, following the visit of three strangers, presumably angels, Sarah miraculously became pregnant, giving birth to a son named Isaac, who God later, in order to test the father's loyalty, commanded be sacrificed, ultimately switching the boy for a lamb instead, and thereby ending the practice of human sacrifice to the Almighty among the peoples of the book, with the notable exception of the Lord's own only begotten son, and with Ishmael in exile, himself becoming the father of the Islamic peoples of the earth. And Shakespeare asked, what's in a name? What perhaps more legitimately might be asked is, how far was the allusion intended to take someone? For me, although Herman Melville himself had apparently been the less favored son in comparison to a more successful older brother prior to his death in his early 30s, the consciously intended answer is an association with an individual who has become a social outcast without the intention of connotations regarding the establishment of Islam or the particular religious practices of approximately 1/6 of today's world population. Melville's narrator then explains that, rather than killing himself during what he characterizes as the damp, drizzling November of his soul, and in order to prevent himself from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking the hats off people, he determined to embark, like the author himself had done at the age of 18 and again at 21, on a sea adventure. Clearly making use on one level of his own experience regarding venturing out of New Bedford, Connecticut on a whaling ship headed for the South Pacific, Melville brings a matrix of biblical allusions to a detailed account of what he had encountered before jumping ship, being captured by cannibals, and then rescued and returned to the United States. A fictional narrative places Ishmael at an inn run by a man named Peter Coffin, exposes him to a painting that, as if somehow preordained, depicts the ending scene of his quest across the surface of the sea with a large whale violently attacking a ship, and places him in the shared bedding accommodation that encloses Ishmael in the sleeping embrace of a tattooed pagan headhunter and harpooner named Quigway, whose custom-made waterproof coffin will ultimately save our narrator's life, making it possible for him to tell the tale. Another story, related before departure, is that of Jonah and the whale, in the form of a sermon delivered to a New Bedford congregation of shipmates on the vast vessel of the earth by one Reverend Maple, stating, "And God had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah," as a way of bringing about his deliverance to divine will. Then, in chapter 19, titled The Prophet, there was a seemingly deranged Elijah, named after a 9th century prophet during the time of Israel's 7th king, Ahab, who suggests that sailing on a ship captained by a man named Ahab is essentially signing away one's soul. clearly alluding to the biblical husband of Jezebel, both of whom, as a result of their worship of the graven image of the Phoenician god Baal, the Old Testament prophet Elijah had predicted would be killed and their blood licked by dogs. Then, of course, there is Captain Ahab, maimed, having lost his leg as a result of a previous encounter with the white whale, Moby Dick, like Isaac's son Jacob in the Bible, who had wrestled with an angel, an agent of the Lord, and consequently came away maimed. It is Ahab who looms large as the most dominant character in Melville's narrative, even if he doesn't really appear until chapter 28, marked with a clearly visible scar like Cain, the biblical eldest farmer, son of the first couple, Adam and Eve, and murderer of his younger brother Abel out of jealousy regarding God's preference for blood sacrifice to his own offerings. Ahab is first seen on deck after the ship, the Pequod, named for a Native American tribe that, according to a comment made by Mark Twain in his relatively recently released autobiography, was largely slaughtered by the good Christians of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had set sail on Christmas Day. Until Captain Ahab's appearance, the good ship Pequod had been commanded by its first mate, Starbuck, a practical, down-to-earth Quaker and married father of two, after whom a certain omnipresent coffee shop is alleged to have been named. Oh, there's also the white whale, the object of Captain Ahab's revenge-inspired obsession, which, as film director and former Andy of Mayberry child actor Ron Howard has documented in a movie titled In the Heart of the Sea, was based upon a real Leviathan that sank a ship called the Essex in 1820. Melville, in order to allow his whale to be easily distinguished from others of its species, chose to make it an albino, and then devoted all of chapter 42 within his romance, The Whiteness of the Whale, to a discussion of the significance of this color, or rather absence of color, observing that in the higher mysteries of the most august religions, it has been made a symbol of the divine, and also an intensifying agent in things most appalling to mankind. And so, Captain Ahab's obsession with the destruction of the white whale that had maimed him takes on connotations beyond hatred for some mere denizen of the deep to make it a symbol, an unreasoning mask that Ahab wants to strike through in order to assail the unknown but still reasoning thing, God, which hides behind it, saying to Starbuck, "Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me." Well, there's symbolism and a confrontation between man and the transcendental force behind the facade of the natural world. There's also such factual detail about the necessary particularities of 19th century whaling as a full chapter devoted to the line used to attach to harpoons so that the boat looks as if it were pulling off with a prodigious great wedding cake to present to the whales. And then, too, there's the story itself, along with its rich cast of unforgettable characters ranging from Ahab to the poor cabin boy Pip, driven mad by fear after being lost at sea in a whaleboat before his rescue, and a secret crew of whalers led by a Zoroastrian harpooner, and much, much more tightly compacted within this all of the above narrative. Then, along with the adventure of reading the book for oneself, there are the implications of the network of references and allusions contained within it, as well as the general understanding being conveyed that everyone must one day individually face, which is that as we each engage in our own personal existential struggle with the forces of the universe, whether absurdly absent of meaning or the product of the intelligent design of a supreme being who works in mysterious ways which are unfathomable to human beings, one way or another, eventually, as illustrated by Melville's enigmatic yet paradoxically truthful work of fiction, it is the universe that will prevail. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.